There was a time in America when a single pot simmering on the stove meant everything was going to be all right. During the Great Depression, lonely winters in small farmhouses, and quiet evenings after retirement, millions of seniors survived on meals so simple they almost disappeared from history. A few potatoes, a ham bone, dried beans, leftover rice, whatever could stretch long enough to make it through another week. But these meals were never just about saving money. They were about dignity, about feeding yourself when the house had grown quiet and the kitchen table no longer filled with family. One elderly steelworker in Pennsylvania reportedly lived on the same humble stew for nearly 3 years, and doctors said he was healthier than men half his age. Tonight, we're uncovering 10 forgotten one-pot meals that carried Americans through some of the hardest years ever lived. Before we begin, subscribe to YouTube and tell us in the comments, what simple meal reminds you most of home? Part 01: Depression Stew. In the winter of 1933, thousands of American families survived on meals that barely cost more than a loaf of bread. In small mining towns across Pennsylvania and West Virginia, one pot often sat on the stove from morning until midnight, quietly feeding anyone who walked through the door. People called it many things, but most simply knew it as depression stew. The recipe changed depending on what was left in the pantry. Usually it began with a small amount of ground beef browned in the bottom of a heavy pot. Then came diced potatoes, canned tomatoes, corn, onions, and enough water to stretch everything further than it should have gone. Salt, pepper, maybe a little garlic if the family could afford it. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. As the stew simmered, the potatoes slowly thickened the broth while the tomatoes gave the kitchen a warm, comforting smell that drifted through old wooden houses during bitter winters. For elderly Americans living alone decades later, this meal became more than survival food. It was familiar, predictable, gentle on aching hands and tired bodies. One pot, one spoon, enough leftovers for several days. Many seniors continued making this exact stew well into the 1980s because it reminded them of parents who survived the Depression without throwing anything away. Some even swore it tasted better reheated the next morning, after the flavors settled together overnight beside the ticking sound of a kitchen clock. It was never served in expensive restaurants. No cookbook celebrated it. Yet for millions of Americans, depression stew carried a quiet message during hard times. Tonight, at least, nobody was going to bed hungry. Part 02: Potato Soup. Long before frozen dinners filled grocery store freezers, potato soup was the meal that carried countless elderly Americans through cold nights when money was tight and cooking felt exhausting. During the 1940s and 1950s, nearly every rural kitchen in America had its own version quietly simmering on the stove, especially in farming communities where potatoes were cheap, filling, and lasted through harsh winters in root cellars beneath old homes. The recipe was painfully simple. A few potatoes peeled slowly at the kitchen table, one onion sliced thin, butter if there was enough, milk if the week had gone well, and salt cracked into the pot without measuring. The potatoes boiled until they softened and broke apart into a thick, creamy broth that smelled warm enough to make an empty house feel alive again. For seniors living alone, potato soup solved problems modern cooking never talks about. It was soft for tired teeth, easy on weak stomachs, and required almost no energy to prepare. Many older Americans made it while sitting down, peeling potatoes beside a radio humming softly in the background. One pot could feed them for days, reheating gently on the stove each evening as darkness settled outside the kitchen windows. During difficult winters, some families added scraps of bacon or stale bread to stretch the soup further. Others kept it plain because plain was all they had. Yet somehow, the smell alone could still remind people of childhood kitchens crowded with brothers, sisters, and tired parents trying to make dinner feel comforting even when the cupboards looked nearly empty. Decades later, many seniors still prepared potato soup from memory without recipes or measurements. They did not cook it because it was fashionable. They cooked it because it once kept the people they loved alive, and in quiet ways it still did. Part 03: Chicken Soup. Few meals in American history carried more comfort than a pot of homemade chicken soup slowly simmering through the afternoon. During the Great Depression, wartime rationing, and the difficult decades that followed, chicken soup became the meal people made when someone was sick, grieving, exhausted, or simply trying to survive another cold week with very little money. In countless small homes across America, elderly women placed an entire chicken into a large enamel pot with carrots, celery, onions, and enough water to fill the house with steam. The soup cooked for hours while windows fogged over and the scent drifted through narrow hallways and quiet living rooms. By evening, the broth turned golden, the vegetables softened completely, and the chicken nearly fell apart with the touch of a spoon. For seniors living alone, chicken soup remained one of the few meals that still felt deeply human. It could last several days, reheated one bowl at a time while old radios played softly nearby. Many older Americans said the smell alone reminded them of mothers who stood beside the stove late into the night caring for sick children during long winters. Some families added noodles or rice if they had enough in the pantry. Others stretched the broth further with potatoes or leftover vegetables from the refrigerator. Nothing was wasted. After the soup was gone, even the bones were often boiled again for another pot. Doctors today speak about nutrients and hydration, but older generations understood chicken soup differently. To them, it meant care. It meant someone was trying to help you feel better. Even seniors preparing it for themselves decades later often described the meal as emotional comfort more than food. In lonely kitchens where silence had replaced busy family dinners, a steaming bowl of chicken soup still carried the feeling that warmth and kindness had not completely disappeared from the world. Part 04: Lentil Stew. During the hardest years of the Great Depression, lentils became one of the quiet heroes of American kitchens. They were cheap, filling, easy to store, and unlike many dried beans, they softened quickly without needing to soak overnight. For struggling families and elderly Americans living alone, lentil stew was the kind of meal that asked for very little while giving enough strength to carry someone through another difficult day. The recipe barely changed from one generation to the next. A cup of dried lentils, a chopped onion, a few carrots, maybe celery if the garden still had some left, all simmered slowly in a single pot with water, salt, and black pepper. As the lentils cooked, they broke apart into a thick, earthy stew that smelled rich despite costing almost nothing to make. In rural towns across Missouri, Kentucky, and Ohio, many seniors prepared lentil stew exactly the way their mothers once had during the 1930s. Some cooked it every week because it stretched small pensions further than canned meals ever could. Others simply loved the familiarity of it. The sound of the bubbling pot, the steam clouding old kitchen windows, the heavy spoon scraping the bottom of the pan. It all felt comforting in a world changing too fast around them. Lentils also carried another quiet advantage for aging Americans. They were soft, gentle on the stomach, and packed with enough protein to keep people healthy even when meat became too expensive to buy regularly. Long before nutrition experts praised lentils as a superfood, older generations already trusted them because they had survived on them. Many seniors ate lentil stew alone at small kitchen tables where large families once gathered decades earlier. Yet even in silence, the meal still carried memories of crowded homes, winter storms outside, and parents who somehow found ways to keep everyone fed when there was almost nothing left in the pantry. Part 05: Tuna Noodle Pot. By the mid-20th century, when canned foods became a staple in American households, one meal quietly appeared in kitchens from coast to coast: tuna noodle pot. It was never glamorous, never photographed for cookbooks, yet it became one of the most dependable one-pot meals for elderly Americans living alone during the 1960s through the 1980s. The ingredients were simple enough to keep on a shelf for months. A can of tuna, a handful of egg noodles, a spoon of canned peas or whatever vegetables were available, and often a can of cream soup to bind everything together. Everything went into a single pot with water, slowly simmering until the noodles softened and absorbed the salty, comforting flavor of the broth. For seniors on fixed incomes, this meal represented control over something unpredictable: hunger. It required no fresh shopping trip, no complicated preparation, and almost no energy. Many older Americans could prepare it even on days when standing at the stove felt difficult, stirring slowly while listening to the ticking of a wall clock or the soft hum of a radio news broadcast. In quiet kitchens across America, tuna noodle pot became more than convenience food. It became routine, something safe, something predictable. The smell of warm noodles and canned tuna drifting through a small apartment often marked the end of another long, silent day. Some added a sprinkle of cheese if they could afford it. Others ate it exactly as it was, finding comfort not in flavor but in familiarity. For many widows and widowers, it was one of the first meals they learned to cook after losing the person they once shared dinners with. Even today, this simple pot still carries the memory of kitchens where meals were no longer about celebration, but about continuing quietly forward, one bowl at a time. Part 06: Red Beans and Rice. In the American South, especially in Louisiana, there was a Monday tradition that quietly fed generations of working families and later became a lifeline for elderly people living alone. Red beans and rice. It was never meant to be complicated. It was meant to last. The dish began with dried red beans soaked overnight, then slowly simmered the next day with onions, bell pepper, celery, and a small piece of smoked sausage or ham bone if it was available. Everything cooked together in one pot for hours, often unattended, while people went about their work or rested through long afternoons. For seniors living on fixed incomes, this meal carried a rare kind of freedom. Once it was on the stove, it needed almost no attention. The beans softened gradually, breaking down into a creamy, rich base while the meat released a deep smoky flavor that filled the kitchen with warmth. In New Orleans households, this dish was often tied to laundry day, when women would cook it slowly while washing clothes, letting time do most of the work. That same rhythm later became perfect for older adults who could no longer stand for long periods but still wanted real, home-cooked meals. A single pot could stretch across several days. Served over rice, it became even more filling, feeding one person multiple meals without ever feeling repetitive. Many seniors would reheat it gently, noticing how the flavor deepened overnight, as if the pot had learned to improve with patience. Even now, red beans and rice remains one of those rare dishes that doesn't ask for attention, skill, or effort. It simply waits, slowly transforming simple ingredients into something that feels steady, grounding, and quietly dependable in a life that often becomes anything but. Part 07: Ham Bone Bean Soup. In many American homes of the mid-20th century, nothing was truly thrown away, especially not after a Sunday meal. The leftover ham bone, stripped nearly clean, was not waste. It was tomorrow's dinner and often several dinners after that. This is how ham bone bean soup became a quiet staple for elderly Americans living alone. The process began with a simple bag of dried navy or pinto beans, soaked overnight to soften them for long cooking. The ham bone went straight into a large pot of water along with chopped onion, sometimes a carrot, and whatever small seasoning was available. Then came hours of slow simmering, often unattended, as the kitchen gradually filled with a deep, smoky aroma that signaled something filling was being created from almost nothing. For seniors on limited incomes, this meal was especially important. One pot could stretch across 3 or 4 days, thickening with each reheating as the beans broke down and absorbed more of the ham's flavor. It was the kind of food that didn't demand constant energy or attention, only time and patience. Many older Americans remembered this soup from childhood kitchens where parents made sure nothing was wasted. Even decades later, the taste carried a sense of continuity, a reminder of households where resourcefulness was not a choice but a necessity. What made ham bone bean soup so powerful was not just its affordability, but its reliability. It filled the stomach, warmed the body, and required almost no effort to keep going. For someone living alone, that mattered more than presentation or variety. In quiet kitchens, the same pot would be reheated again and again, each bowl slightly thicker than the last, until nothing remained except a softened bone and the memory of meals that once brought a full table together. Part 08: Chicken and Rice Pot. In many American households throughout the 1950s and 1960s, chicken and rice was the kind of meal that quietly appeared on the table when there was nothing else planned, but everything still needed to feel like dinner. For elderly Americans living alone later in life, it became one of the most dependable one-pot meals they could still prepare without strain or complication. The recipe was simple enough to remember without ever writing it down. A few pieces of chicken, often thighs or leftover cuts, were browned gently in a pot, then combined with rice, onion, and a basic broth or water with salt. As it simmered, The rice slowly absorbed every bit of flavor, turning soft and rich while the chicken became tender enough to fall apart with almost no effort. This was not a meal that demanded attention. It was a meal that allowed rest. Once the lid was on the pot, time did the work. For seniors with aching joints or limited energy, that mattered more than anything else. They could sit nearby, listening to the soft bubbling sound, knowing dinner would take care of itself. In many families, chicken and rice carried memories of simpler evenings when children sat around the table waiting for food, and the kitchen felt full even before the first bite. Years later, that same smell returning from a single pot could bring back entire households that no longer existed. Some added peas or carrots when available. Others kept it plain, letting the chicken speak for itself. Either way, it stretched across multiple meals, reheating easily without losing comfort or texture. For those eating alone, chicken and rice was never just about nourishment. It was about routine, warmth, and the quiet reassurance that even in solitude, something familiar could still be made with very little effort. Part 09: Navy Bean Soup. In countless American kitchens across the 1930s through the 1970s, navy bean soup became one of those quiet, dependable meals that never needed attention or praise. It was simply there, filling pots in the background of long days, especially in homes where every ingredient had to stretch further than it should have. The foundation was always the same. Dried navy beans soaked overnight until they softened, then slowly simmered in a large pot of water with onion, salt, and whatever small piece of smoked meat could be spared, often just a fragment of ham or bacon. As the hours passed, the beans broke down, thickening the broth into something rich, creamy, and deeply comforting. For elderly Americans living alone, navy bean soup carried a kind of quiet reliability. It didn't require constant stirring or perfect timing. It forgave mistakes. Left too long on low heat, it didn't fail, it improved. That made it especially valuable for older people dealing with fatigue, memory lapses, or simply the slow pace of aging. Many seniors prepared it exactly as they had seen it done decades earlier, without measuring anything, relying instead on memory and instinct. The smell alone often brought back images of crowded family kitchens, winter evenings, and parents who believed that a simple pot of beans could solve more problems than words ever could. A single batch could last several days, thickening with each reheating until it became almost stew-like. Served with bread or eaten alone, it remained filling and steady, never demanding anything more than a spoon and a quiet moment at the table. Navy bean soup was never meant to impress anyone. It was meant to endure, and for many who lived long enough to cook it alone, it still quietly did. Part 10: Potato and Onion Stew. In the quiet kitchens of rural America during the early and mid-20th century, few meals were as unremarkable in appearance yet as dependable as potato and onion stew. It was the kind of dish that never made it into cookbooks or restaurant menus, but it lived in thousands of homes where survival depended on whatever could be grown, stored, or stretched through the week. The recipe was almost too simple to call a recipe. Potatoes peeled slowly at the counter, onions sliced into rough pieces, both dropped into a single pot of water with salt and left to simmer until the kitchen filled with a soft, earthy aroma. As it cooked, the potatoes began to break down, naturally thickening the broth while the onions dissolved into sweetness, turning plain ingredients into something warm and sustaining. For elderly Americans living alone, this stew carried a special kind of ease. It required no meat, no complicated steps, and no energy beyond what aching hands could manage. Many prepared it while sitting nearby, occasionally stirring as the pot quietly transformed itself without urgency or pressure. In earlier generations, this dish often appeared in homes where winters were long and cupboards were nearly empty by the end of the week. Families relied on it because it could feed many people for almost nothing, and the ingredients were almost always available even in the hardest times. Years later, seniors continued to cook it not out of necessity, but memory. The smell alone could bring back kitchens filled with voices, wooden tables crowded with family, and the feeling that even the simplest food once meant togetherness. Potato and onion stew was never meant to be extraordinary. It survived because it didn't need to be. These 10 meals were never created for attention, presentation, or comfort in the modern sense. They were born in quieter times, when kitchens were small, Incomes were uncertain, and every ingredient had to earn its place in the pot. Yet somehow, out of that simplicity, something lasting was formed. For many elderly Americans, these dishes became more than food. They became routine, memory, and a way to keep going when life felt increasingly silent. A single pot on the stove often meant stability for days, sometimes even a reminder of family tables that no longer existed. What makes these meals powerful today is not just their history, but their purpose. They asked for very little, yet gave back enough to carry people through some of the hardest moments of their lives. If any of these meals reminded you of someone from your past, or a kitchen you once stood in, share it in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe to YouTube for more forgotten histories hidden inside everyday life.